Thank you for joining week 11 problem solving session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. This course is being taught by Dr. Harjit Choshin Lakha, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. So I'm Isha Rathore, PMRF and Research Scholar at Department of Architecture and Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. And I usually take these sessions on Saturday. There's another session on Tuesday being taken by Ms. Monica S., who's another PMRF and Research Scholar at Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. So a few housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself for the session. If you have any questions or if you want to put answers, you can post them in the chat box. I will moderate the chat box. And if you have any queries, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself at different points in the presentation when I stop for taking queries from your side. So the outline of the session is that we're going to look up at the highlights from each of the week, and we're going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture unit. And we're also going to look up at the assignment questions from the previous one of the NPTEL course, as well as the assignment of week 11, since the deadline for the same has passed. So we will look up at the solution to these assignment questions with explanations from the relevant course content. And if we received any queries from you during the week on the week's content in the discussion forums, we will also clarify those queries. So please use the discussion forums to put forward your questions or any queries you raise while going through the course content. So week 11 was looking up at implementation and follow-up. So let's dive into the highlights from week 11. So lecture 51 talked about the AIA methods for land acquisition, resettlement and livelihoods. We looked up at scoping and initial planning. So we looked up at questions like the extent of land acquisition and resettlement, the cost of compensation and mitigation measures, the feasibility of the project, whether the project is feasible or not, and the stakeholder views about the project. And then for scoping land acquisition and resettlement, you need to establish a multidisciplinary team from a wide background so that they raise concerns and queries and ask relevant questions such that the best decisions are made. Then you also need to review the project design, review the existing primary and secondary socioeconomic data, and benchmark the land acquisition and resettlement against other projects of similar scale and magnitude, and develop project plans and zone of project influence. So to determine these zones of project influence, so there are two types of zones of project influence. We have the primary zone, which is also the zone of direct impact. So in this we have areas where the project activities and facilities are located. So these include access routes, water, power supply networks, supply chains and employee accommodation. And then we had the secondary zone, which is the larger area in which the project is located, and that will encounter the main economic impacts from the project, including the influx of economic migrants as well as employment and business opportunities which will arise because of the new development which will come up. Then for profiling and baseline data collection, we looked up at the social impact assessment. So this is a social profile which describes the affected committees, and their likely concerns about the resettlement are also addressed in the social impact assessment. So critical purpose of doing a comprehensive baseline is to look up at environmental and social impacts and the risks and opportunities associated with them, to determine the eligibility for compensation and resettlement housing using fair practices and the market standards and the resettlement housing, monitoring the implementation of the resettlement action plan and the preparation of environmental and social management plans. For data collection, we can use census data, which is the data which is collected every 10 years by the Government of India across the entire country on the demographic profile of the population, their economic status and other things. So you can use census data for your location, for the site of the people who will be displaced. Then you can also undertake a socioeconomic baseline survey which you conduct at the site level, and collect additional information on household access to social services, including the healthcare, water, education, skills training, We can also collect information about livelihood activities, including the employment, agriculture, trading, services, and natural resources. So all of this data can be collected on the site. And for data collection measures, because there's a restricted access, there should be restricted access to the data, because a huge amount of data is generated and there's a risk of this data being misused and for fraud and other things. So the team should be very careful about the access, who has access, and how the data is being safely stored. They should also meet the national, regional, and international legal requirements for storing and collecting data, and they should have qualified people as per the national standards. The survey teams and national evaluation experts, such that they're sensitive in asking questions and gathering responses. Then the data processing should also be independent, and there should be scrutiny and possible legal action. The project orientation and training would be needed for the team, such that they understand the task which they are undertaking while doing the surveys and collecting data, maintaining data, and storing data. So quality control measures should also be adopted during the surveying and data collection stages. Daily section of forms and input data are required. The space should also be formed to allow government and community witnesses to confirm that the service processes have been explained to the asset owners in their own language and that their assets have been properly recorded. So because a lot of these regions might have their own languages, and the mode of communication could be obstacles, so there should be the answers and the questions should be explained to the landowners in a very clear language, preferably in the local language, such that they understand the questions and they can respond correctly to those questions, and then these answers can be recorded correctly by the survey taker. And the asset owner should be verified by appropriate IDs, such that which associates them to the land correctly. And various specialist studies can also be undertaken to provide an in-depth understanding or recommendations for supporting the livelihood restoration planning for these people who will be required to resettle and whose land is being acquired for development. Then we also looked up at the Resettlement Action Plan, or the RAP. So the key components of a resettlement action plan include the project description, the potential impacts, the legal and institutional frameworks, the baseline studies, and these could include census, surveys, socioeconomic studies, key people interviews, and focus groups. Then we also include the stakeholder engagement, their opinions and considerations on issues which they face. These should also be rectified, the eligibility and valuation of losses and compensation entitlement with the fair market prices, and the correct compensation calculation, giving value to all of the assets and calculating the losses where applicable. Then also towards the livelihood restoration, that these people's if their livelihood is being affected because of the move or the settlement, that the livelihood should also be restored at the new location or at the new resettlement. The housing, infrastructure and social services, the organizational responsibilities, the schedule, the budget of the project, the monitoring and evaluation and reporting of the project. And the extent of the settlement impacts depends on the magnitude of the displacement, the characteristics of the project, the mitigation measures, and the characteristics of the community. So typical social impacts which arise from the settlement are people's capabilities, abilities, and freedom to achieve their goals. So because any sort of change, especially such a big change of moving from one house to another in a totally new environment, leads to people adapting to that change, and during that time period their capacity, their productivity, abilities and freedoms are sort of restricted, and by this coping and adapting mechanism to their new surroundings, so their capacities, abilities and freedom undergo like a decline. So these are some of the social impacts which these people will face. Then also the community or social supports and political context, because they are being relocated to a new location which will have their own communities which are living there and a sort of political atmosphere. So they will need to adapt and adjust to these changes in the social sense and in the political sense. So that change will also take some time and could also be a cause of discomfort for them. Then also adapting to livelihood assets and activities, access to culture and religion, finding cultural places or places of worship, access to infrastructure and services, getting access to all of these things, and in this totally new environment, and could be challenging for the population. The housing and business structures, the deterioration of land and natural resources, and the poor living environment. So all of these are social impacts which arise from the resettlement of a population or a community. And then we also looked at compensation arrangements. So the International Finance Commission recommends that projects prepare an entitlement matrix to identify the affected people, which are the people who are entitled to compensation, including their property and land right owners, tenants, squatters, sharecroppers, grazers, nomadic pastoralists, and other natural resource users, vendors and other service providers, communities and vulnerable groups. All of these people who are somehow associated with the site and the land which is being acquired. So all of these people need to be identified, and then all type of losses or impacts associated with each category of these affected population or entitled people, including loss of physical assets, loss of access to physical assets, loss of wages, rent or sale earnings, loss of public infrastructure, and elements of cultural significance. So all of these impacts should be identified across all of the categories of these affected people, and then the type of compensation and assistance or the entitlement to each of these categories should be determined based on these analysis of loss or impacts to each of these categories, and then the compensation should be paid to them. Then we also looked at site selection or the project procedure. So we looked at establishing the resettlement site selection criteria, the project design, land use mapping, preliminary options assessment, and presenting the preliminary options to stakeholders. We also looked at the implementation and handover. So implementation means putting the resettlement action plan into the action, or going forward with the workings of the resettlement action plan. So a handover process completes the physical resettlement process, and support for livelihood continues until the restoration is achieved. And the project has a responsibility to assist the resettled community in becoming fully established in the new location. And then we also looked up at livelihood restoration and enhancement in terms of vulnerable or at-risk groups. So as per the IFC definition, so vulnerable or at-risk groups are people who by virtue of gender, ethnicity, age, physical or mental disability, economic disadvantage or social status may be more diversely affected by displacement than others, and who may be limited in their ability to claim or take advantage of resettlement assistance and related development benefits. So these vulnerable groups or at-risk groups need to be dealt very sensitively, and they will not be able to cope with the changes or the resettlement process as efficiently as the normal population groups, because they are sort of limited in their abilities across all of these either of these categories which are mentioned. So they will need to be dealt very sensitively in the resettlement plan. Then during the monitoring and evaluation, we had planned components like doing a performance monitoring, impact monitoring, and a completion audit. Then for the key indicators for monitoring and evaluation, we had the payment of compensation, the resolution of grievances of the resettled population, the community perception towards the project. So usually the community has a very negative perception towards the project which came up because it involves such a significant change. So changing that perception and having the community understand that the project was important and that they are happy because of the resettlement is also a key indicator of the resettlement action plan and the monitoring and evaluation phase. And then also changes in household incomes, agricultural productivity and employment in comparison to their previous values is also an indicator of could also be an indicator during the monitoring and evaluation phase. So next we move on to lecture 52, where we looked up at EIA methods on resource efficiency. So we looked up at definitions and concepts of resource efficiency. So resource efficiency is measured in terms of measure of inputs required in the proposed development at each phase, and also at the measure of waste generated in the proposed development at each phase. So for example, energy and water. And then life cycle assessment is determined in terms of upstream and downstream impacts. So upstream impacts are in terms of inputs, so where and how the original materials are produced, processed and manufactured, how they are packaged and transported, and how they are used. Whereas downstream impacts are in terms of how resulting wastes are managed. So these are in terms of waste generated and its management. And then we looked at the typical product life cycle. So we had the product material, which is then processed and manufactured, and then is packaged and transported. It's then used and its disposal. So this is a typical product life cycle, and these can be for material, energy, land, water. And then after disposal, it can be reused or recycled, so it again goes back into the system. And we looked up at the framework for life cycle assessment. So we have the goal and scope definition, then we have an inventory analysis, and then we have the impact assessment and the interpretation. We have direct applications to life cycle assessment in product development, improvement, in strategic planning, in public policy making, marketing, and other applications. So again, general life cycle flow diagram is in terms of raw material acquisition, and then material manufacture, the product or product manufacture, product use or consumption, and then final disposal into landfills or by combustion, reusing or recycling. And in all of these stages, we have energy, which is the input which is being used, and waste which are being generated. So you have both upstream and downstream impacts which are happening at the same time. Then we also looked up at the concept of energy and mass balance. So we have the sum of mass going into a system must be equal to the sum of mass going out or being stored in the system. And then we have sum of energy going into a system must be equal to the sum of energy going out of it, plus any changes in the composition of that system. So energy and mass remain the same in any system. Then we also looked up at closed loop systems, which is when a waste product can be used as a resource, either in the same process or elsewhere. So the resource efficiency increases. So it sort of forms like a closed loop, because it goes from waste to being an input again. So it closes that loop and does not act as an exit point. So that is why these systems are known as closed loop systems. Then we also looked up at the concept of waste hierarchy, self-sufficiency, and resilience. So we had the waste hierarchy. So in waste hierarchy, we reduce the amount of waste which is produced. If you cannot reduce it, you reuse the materials, and then you recycle the materials into new products. And you recover, if you cannot recycle and if no recycling is further possible, you recover the energy from this waste, and then you put them into landfills such that it does not pollute the environment in any other way. And then we looked up at self-sufficiency and resilience in terms of allowing more inputs to be achieved from a given amount of input, such that maximum output is being achieved in terms of housing, food, energy, etc. And then some of the questions on project characteristics include will construction or operation of project use natural resources like land, water, material, or energy, especially any resources which are non-renewable or are in short supply. So you look up at if all of these factors are being, natural resources are being used efficiently or not, like land, water, minerals, aggregates, forest and timber, energy, and any other resources. And similarly, you ask questions like, will the project produce solid waste or waste during construction, operation, or decommissioning phase, whether it will be spoiled, overburden, or mine waste, municipal waste, hazardous or toxic waste including radioactive waste, or other type of industrial waste, surplus product, sewage, sludge, construction or demolition waste, any sort of redundant machinery or equipment, contaminated soils or other material, agricultural waste or any other solid waste. So you ask these questions during the scoping and baseline studies. Okay. Okay, so this is done. I need to do this one now.
Ma'am, you are not audible.
Can you hear me now?
Ah,
You can hear me now, right?
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is again expressed in terms of frequency and consequences. So frequency is the number of times the this risk is likely to occur, and consequences are the impacts which are associated with this risk. So the frequency multiplied by consequences gives an idea of the risk of the event or a natural or a hazard to occur. So these concerns include individual concerns as well as societal concerns. So individual concerns relate to how individuals perceive risk from a particular hazard and how it affects them directly and how it affects their daily lives or the things that they personally value. And societal concerns are in a broader sense, which relates to those hazards which impact society rather than an individual. And this is usually associated with an accident or an event that leads to significant or and widespread impacts, causing multiple fatalities or injuries or deaths. So these are two type of concerns which are associated with risks. And then we also looked up at the framework for tolerability of risk. So we have the unacceptable region. So this is where this cannot be justified except in extraordinary circumstances. We have this tolerable if allowed region, which is risk is taken only if a benefit is required. And this is tolerable only if risk reduction is impractical or if its cost is grossly disproportionate to the improvement which is gained. And this is tolerable if cost of reduction would exceed the improvement. And then we have the broadly acceptable region where it's necessary to maintain that the assurance that risk remains at this level. So usually projects should try to keep below the broadly acceptable regions, and most of the projects or development projects are in this broadly acceptable region only. Some of the projects which deal with which have a different type of category like industrial projects which deal with the use of chemicals or nuclear power plants and things like that, they have to be in this tolerable if region because they are undertaking a risk which is exposure to chemicals and exposure to chemicals and exposure to nuclear and radioactive substances if something goes wrong. So they take that risk of exposure and hazard event to happen, but they have a benefit of generation of products which require these chemicals or the generation of nuclear energy. So they take this risk, but because there's a benefit which is achievable because of taking this risk, so they fall into this tolerable if region. In no case should a project ever be in the unacceptable region where they are taking risk without any justification or benefit being achieved, and where the chances of risk are very high and the chances of hazardous event taking place because of uh, any process or framework falling out of control of the operator of the process. So project should be at most at the tolerable if allowed region. Then we also looked up at the FN criteria, which is the number of fatalities by the frequency of events. So there is a broadly acceptable line and there's an intolerable line. And so the project should aim for, in terms of its number of fatalities and frequency of events happening, it should try to be below or within this area below intolerable region. And there are several pros and cons associated with the same, which you can look up um, at your own end if you're interested. So this is the FN criteria. So F is for frequency and N is for number of fatalities. So which is why this is known as FN criteria. And we looked up at risk assessment in a broader risk management framework. So in risk assessment, we first identify the hazards, which are the things which could likely go wrong in the project, which can lead to an event which can cause natural or any type of hazards. And then you need to identify the consequences or in the case if any of these things go wrong and if the hazard situation is realized, and then you determine the likelihood that things will go wrong, including the nature and extent of uncertainties which are associated with so because the calculations based on determining so you obviously determine the likelihood of things that could go wrong based on certain perceptions and assumptions. So, of course, there are uncertainties associated in when you define your values, saying that there's a risk that there's a 10% risk that such an event will occur. So this 10% is calculated based on certain assumptions. So of course these are uncertainties. So you need to consider plus minus 5% or something like that to account for these uncertainties in your calculations based on the assumptions which you have made. And then you establish the acceptability of the risk level. That is, you compare you compare it to the international national acceptability criteria for risk, and you establish the acceptability of the risk in your particular case. And so post assessment, you need to do two type of things, which is first make the use it for decision making. That is, your proposal may be required to reduce the risk further if the risk is unacceptable or if it is refused. And you also need to look up at ongoing control, which is you need to continue monitoring and control of risks from your end by doing regular maintenance and regular checking and establishing that the risk that the likelihood of things of going wrong should not occur. So these are post-assessment things which you need to do to reduce risks. And then, so in the mitigation, again, there's a mitigation hierarchy. So you need to reduce, the first step you need to do is reduce. That is, you need to reduce the likelihood of risks happening. And if the risk is too high, then the proposal will need to be modified to reduce that risk to acceptable levels. And the second step is to avoid. That is, if the risk is too high, then an alternative location could be considered for the industry, or no sensitive land use could be permitted within the tolerable or unacceptable risk contours. So there's a hierarchy. You first reduce, and if you cannot reduce, then you avoid it. Then you avoid the risk. And then we looked up at the quantitative risk assessment, or the QRA. And so in the quantitative risk assessment, you first you start and you identify the risk areas from your project. Then you select a risk area, you identify the failure cases. That is, this is failure cases are the likelihood of things going wrong. Then you select a particular failure case. So these failure cases can be a number of things. So for example, if we consider the a gas plant, a toxic gas plant, so the risk area is the let's say the storage of gas, and then we identify failure cases as if the infrastructure which stores this gas has a leakage. So this is one of the failure cases. The second case can be that the pipeline uh, which connects to the infrastructure that has a leakage or that gets cut, that is another failure case. So then you look up at the failure cases, you look up at a particular failure case, you identify the consequences of this failure case. Then you select the consequences outcome, you determine the frequency, that is the likelihood of this failure case to occur, and then you estimate the risk. Then you record the frequency and consequence in a summary and have all consequence outcomes. Then you define if all consequence outcomes have been studied. So again, then you go back to these consequences outcomes. So if there were multiple consequence outcome, you need to do this step again. And then you ask if all failure cases have been done. So if you remember, we selected one particular failure case here. So if you have multiple failure cases, then you need to cases here, you need to and then is within acceptable or tolerable limits, then your risk assessment is complete. If it is not, then you need to consider all of the risk areas.
Okay, so this was what we discussed in lecture 53 on risk and risk assessment. Then moving on to lecture 54, this was on EIA methods on cumulative effects. So we first looked up at definitions and concepts relating to cumulative effects. So cumulative effects or impacts are, as defined by the USCEQ, is impacts on the environment which result from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions. And the European Commission defined this as impacts that result from the incremental change caused by other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable actions together with the project. So, and the International Financial Commission defined cumulative impacts as those that arise from successive, incremental, and or combined effects of an action, project, or activity when added to other existing planned and or reasonably anticipated future ones. So basically, cumulative effects are. So we will also look up at a graphical representation of cumulative effects later, but these are the definitions given by different agencies and different sources. So you can make a note of keywords which these agencies use in describing definition for cumulative effects. Then these cumulative effects can be of two types. So we have additive effects. So additive effects are based on the sum of magnitudes of the same effect. So for example, noise and noise from two different sources act as an additive effect, additive cumulative effect, and the combined effect is assessed as if resulting from a single point. So, for example, if your house is situated near a temple and if there's a new construction activity happening, so the noise from the temple during a prayer time and the construction noise at working capacity, both of these noise combined together acts as a cumulative effect, cumulative noise effect, which you hear at your house location. And similarly, synergistic effects are difficult to recognize and they're complex to assess as they can arise from the combination of different effects. So, for example, noise and visual effects together when looked at together, as the effects can be intra, which is they are occurring within one project, program, or plan, and they can be as well as inter, which is occurring from different projects, programs, or plans. So, for example, your house is again near this temple and this construction activity, and then so this construction activity results in the building of a let's say a very tall high-rise building, which does not fit in the which causes like a visual displeasure because of the surrounding low height buildings. So from your house, you hear the noise from the temple during the prayer time, and you also have this visual displeasure of this new residential high-rise building. So these are two different effects, which is noise and visual effects, which act together. So these are synergistic effects. So again, these are difficult to recognize and they are very complex to assess because they are a combination of two different type of things. So synergistic effects are much complex compared to additive effects. And then we also have intra-project and inter-project effects. So intra-project effects are intra-project cumulative effects are effects which occur between the different environmental topics within the same proposal as a result of that development's direct effects. And inter-project effects are the form of cumulative effects which occur as a result of the likely impacts of the proposed development interacting with the impacts of other developments in the vicinity. So if within the same construction project, you have noise from one construction activity and noise from another construction activity, both of them both of them together act as an intra-project cumulative effect when seen by an outsider. Whereas if the noise from one construction site and the noise from another construction site together, as seen by a third party, is a inter-project cumulative effect because they are coming from two different project sources. Okay, so then we have indirect impacts. So these are impacts on the environment which are not a direct result of the project, and they are often produced away from or as a result of complex pathways, and sometimes they're referred to as second or third level impacts or secondary impacts. So your development produces an impact, which is an indirect impact, which is the direct impact, and then you have another impact which is caused because of this particular impact, which is the indirect impact from this development project. So anything which is generated as a result of impact from a project, that is the impact of a project on something, is like a secondary impact. It is not directly related to the development, but it is caused by the development in a secondary sense. So this is a much better explanation of cumulative effect. So if you have two different developments and you have the same type of impact from both of these developments, so both of them together are considered in a cumulative impact as impact A. So this is a inter-project cumulative effect, because you have two different projects which are leading to two different impacts, which are seen as a single impact because of the same nature of impact. So cumulative effect is the impact that results from incremental changes caused by other past, present, or reasonably foreseeable actions together with the project. And again, impact interactions. So the reaction between impacts, whether between the impacts of just one project or between the impacts of other projects in the areas. So interaction is when two type of impacts, so they can either cancel each other out also, but they usually amplify each other. So this is the sort of interaction which they have, and this leads to the cumulative impact. So again, this impact can be of a lesser nature or a much amplified nature. Usually it's of a amplified nature. So these are basically impact interactions, how these impacts interact with each other. And then, so we looked up at valued ecosystem components in the landscape module as well. So these are basically environmental features which may be affected by a project and which have been identified to be of concern by the proponent, government agencies, Aboriginal people, or the public. And so the difference between EIA and cumulative impact assessment is that they both share the same logical framework and analytical process and tools, but they have two different perspectives. That is, EIA is project-centered, whereas cumulative impacts are based on the uh, result of the projects and the interaction of the impacts together. And the impacts on the valued ecosystem services are identified, and there's a mitigation hierarchy which is used in EIA as compared to the cumulative impact assessment. Then we also look up at the environmental impact assessment study from a project-centered perspective. So you have so when you have a project, you can have n number of impacts which this project have on different environmental parameters, environmental and social parameters, and these impacts can have indirect impacts on different components of the environment again. But from a but in the cumulative impact assessment from a valued ecosystem component perspective, we have the project. We have one project. So we measure the impact on the valued ecosystem services from different projects. So all of these projects are generating different type of direct or indirect impacts, which are being clubbed together into a cumulative impact being felt by the valued ecosystem services. So this is how we look about cumulative impact assessment instead of so in EIA, we basically assess all of these impacts separately and provide mitigation strategies separately for all of these impacts. Whereas in the cumulative impact assessment, we consider the cumulative impact together instead of looking up at all of these different impacts as separately. So then we also looked about the cumulative impact components. So these are the anticipated future conditions, which is the total effect of the other existing and predictable future developments and external natural environment and social drivers, and the contribution of the development and the evaluation to cumulative effects. So the components are defined by the anticipated future conditions, which is the total effects in the existing and the predictable future developments on the different environmental or social parameters. And then we looked up at the overall methodology for doing a cumulative impact assessment. So we have different methods like consultant questionnaires, checklists, spatial analysis, network systems, expert opinions, matrices, modeling, threshold analysis. And then we required information in terms of the project descriptions, in terms of the nature of the project, scale, phasing, layout, emissions, and other ancillary information. Then we also have again the environmental baseline, which is the geographical and time frame conditions, the data required from different sources, collecting data from different sources, identifying sensitive areas, carrying capacity threshold or regulatory frameworks, considering the influence of other activities, and if you have any networks or systems within the project, that identification. Then again, we identify the magnitude and significance of the different impacts, their frequency, value, influence from past. Then in mitigation, how these impacts can be mitigated, what sort of mitigation measures can be undertaken, and then the monitoring of those mitigation effects, and the reporting of the overall process. And so in the scoping and baseline, so we have cumulative effects assessment or CEA. We have cumulative impact assessment, which is CIA, and the cumulative effects assessment and management, which is CEAM. So the cumulative effects assessment and management, or the CEAM, is a systematic procedure for identifying and evaluating the significance of the effects from multiple activities within the framework of the EIA process. So the purpose of doing a cumulative impact assessment is to consider the incremental contribution of the project together with the effects from other activities, present, past, or future activities of the project, and including them in the environmental impact assessment report. So we can skip this. The categories of actions which can be included in the cumulative impact assessment is to ascertain whether the action will proceed or there's a high probability that the action will proceed. That is, the project is approved or it is submitted under review or there's a submission for regulatory review. Uh, then we also have the category which is reasonably foreseeable, which is the action may proceed, but there is some uncertainty. And these are basically if they identify any proponent which does not meet which does not meet the regulatory framework, whether the project under review has a conditional clause and the action cannot be achieved, whether it's identified in an approved development plan, whether it's identified in a development plan whose approval is not yet, uh, which has the development plan has not been approved as of yet, but the development plan will be approved in the future. And the third category is hypothetical, which is there is considerable uncertainty as to the action will ever proceed. So this is when there's likelihood that the project has used something as a benchmark, which is not approved or peer reviewed. So in that case, the CEA is hypothetical, and it cannot be achieved based on the current regulations and procedures which we have. Then in the scoping and impact identification and evaluation technique. So we have network analysis, consultant questionnaires, checklists, and spatial mapping. We also have matrices and expert opinion, which is a common method for scoping impact identification and evaluation technique. For evaluation in cumulative effects, we can use modeling and we can use carrying capacity analysis. So carrying capacity is the capacity of an ecosystem or any of the um, any of the parameters which is the highest potential it can achieve. So that is what is defined as the carrying capacity. And then we have the proximate cause or test of significance. So we have the three-phase procedure for performing a defensible CIA. So by defensible CIA, we mean cumulative effect assessment, which is approved or which will likely be approved. So the first step is to determine whether the proposal would proximately cause a significant effect on a given resource. Then the second step is to investigate how the affected environment has reached its current condition and the projected trajectory as a result of the aggregate effects of past actions. That is the affected environment, defining an appropriate spatial and temporal scale for impact assessment. And the third step is again determining what happens to the condition and trends of this resource if no action is taken, including effects of other present and future actions, and what happens to this maintained or altered trend if the proposed or alternative actions are taken. Uh, And then we also looked up at the mitigation for cumulative effects. So mitigation should be proportionate to the nature of the cumulative effects, and these measures can include reducing the construction and operational aspects of the development, especially those which are causing individual effects, which are amplifying the cumulative effects. Then providing a provision to measure and manage the effects, and the another measure is to restrict the extent of the proposed development or to plan the proposed development such that these effects are not generated simultaneously, leading to this cumulative effect generation. So that is the mitigation effort. So there's again a mitigation hierarchy for dealing with the cumulative effects. So the first is information exchange, which is identifying what sort of activities are ongoing at a present moment on the site. And then the second step is pooling of resources uh, so that uh, only one activity or action is being undertaken at a particular time, such that multiple sources of effect generation do not happen at the same time. And the third is proactive management of timing and location of developments, such that again they do not overlap and cause cumulative effects. Then we also looked up at the environmental management plan, which is the measures which can be taken during the so then you moved on to lecture 55, which was on environmental management plans. So these are measures which can be taken during the implementation and operation of a project to eliminate or offset adverse environmental impacts or to reduce them to acceptable levels. And the actions needed to implement these measures, that is the EMP, is an integral part of the EIA. And so there are two categories, which is category A and category B. So these are again based on whether there's a need for environmental management plan in the category or not. And so the aim of doing environmental management plan is to provide an essential link between the impacts which are predicted and the mitigation measures which are specified in the EIA report and their implementation and operational activities. So you have a link between the impacts and the mitigation measures in a document. And then we had key legislation and policy and guidelines, which were given by the International Finance Commission and the investment banks. There is no legislative requirement to produce the environmental management plan explicitly, but there are sections which talk about using selected examples from national legislation, outlining key policies and standards which require EMP. And then we also have guidances from a few of these resources, like the International Council for Mining and Metals, the Design Manuals for Road and Bridge UK, the International Association for Impact Assessment, which has a Social Impact Management Plan, SIMP, and the Institute for Environment Management and Assessment, IEMA, which gives the best practices series, which talks about the environmental management plans. So these documents provide guidance as to doing an EMP. So the outline methodology and EMP structure is that you have a contractual agreement. Then you have competent environmental professionals who can make this EMP document. They also have to do a collaboration with stakeholders where they hear their opinions and views and involve these stakeholders in the decision making and planning stages. Then they then distribute the roles and responsibilities of the different professionals in writing different sections and different chapters, and identifies key documents or references from the previous slides. And then they decide the procedure to be followed and the approach and the methods which needs to be used for making the AMP. So the structure is a chapter title where you describe the chapter contents, then you describe the cover where you record issue number, date, revisions, reasons for change, the issuing authority and their contact details. Then you define the content, which is the executive summaries, which is the key issues and findings from the entire chapter. Then you have introduction, which includes the summary of project, environment parameters, and the aims of the environmental management plan. Then we have the project summary, which covers the project location, layout plans, project phases, construction activities, other construction-related things, schedule, their description, what sort of effects they are generating, um, what sort of guidances they have used for coming up with the legal and planning context. And then we have the summary of effects where we describe the positive, negative effects from all of the associated project activities and the mitigation efforts which were undertaken for all of these effects. Then we have the methodology for the EMP, including limitations. Then we define the project team roles and responsibilities if multiple organizations are involved. Then what sections and what details they have covered, what methods they have used. Then we have the applicable legal framework and standards, consents and permissions. So these records the consents which were taken from the relevant agencies and who have approved the EIA report. Then the cost estimates for the ASMP implementation, then the environmental and socially significant changes, then the site-specific environmental and social actions, including if there was land covered in the week 11 content. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now before we move into the questions, practice questions from the previous run of the EIA course. So you can just unmute yourself and ask any question if you have so far. Okay, so we will move forward with the question and answers. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat box as well. I will moderate the chat box as well. Okay. So the first question is match the project influence zone in context of AIA given in group 1 with the description in group 2. So we have the primary zone and the secondary zone and their definitions. You can post the answers in the chat box. Okay, so we have an answer. Okay, so A is the correct answer. So primary zones are zones of direct impact area where project activities and facilities are located, including access routes, water and power supply networks, supply chains, employee accommodation. Whereas secondary zones are larger regions in which the project is located that will encounter the main economic impacts from the project, including the influx of economic migrants as well as employment and business opportunities. So B matches with 1 and 2 matches with 2. So A was the correct answer as you stated. So moving on to question 2. So we have the components of a standard resettlement action plan, RAP, given in group 1 with their description in group 2. So in group 1, we have the different components of the resettlement action plan, and group 2, we have their description of what they cover. We need to match group 1 with group 2. Okay, so we have an answer D, which is the correct answer. So livelihood restoration looks at measures to improve and restore the livelihoods of displaced people. So P matches with 4. The schedule is covers all resettlement activities from preparation to implementation and how resettlement is linked to the implementation of the overall project. So Q matches with 1. Then baseline studies include summary of studies undertaken, including the census, data surveys, socioeconomic studies which were conducted on site, key people interview, focus groups, etc. So R matches with 2. And then eligibility and valuation of losses and compensation entitlements is the methodology which is used to value the losses under the local laws and supplementary measures needed to achieve full replacement cost. So this is to calculate that the fair compensation is given and all of the valuation assets are being valued at fair prices as per the local law. So P matches with 4, Q matches with 1, R matches with 2, and S matches with 3. So D is the correct answer. So moving on to question 3, the extent of resettlement impacts depend on the following. First, magnitude of displacement. Second, characteristics of the project and its mitigation measures. Third, characteristics of the community. And fourth, all of the above. So you need to include all of the options which are correct. Okay, so again, we have an answer D, which is the correct answer. So the extent of the settlement impacts depends on all of the three options which were given in the option 1, 2, 3, which is the magnitude of displacement, the characteristics of the project and its mitigation measures, and the characteristics of the community. So D4, all of the above was the correct answer, as you stated. So moving on to question 4. You need to match the following terms of group A with their description in group B. So again, we have terms in group A relating to resource efficiency, and in group B, we have their description. So just a tip for the examination, the definitions and descriptions of terms is important in all of the modules. So you can just understand what these terms mean and then try to read through the options to determine what makes the most sense as to the definition of the given term. If you have an understanding of the definition of the term, then you can possibly match the correct definition together. So we looked up at all of these terms in the module on resource efficiency. Okay, so the correct answer is C. So resource efficiency measures includes the measure of inputs and waste generated in the proposed development at every phase. So resource efficiency, as we studied in the past slides, we saw that resource efficiency is defined by two things, which is the amount of inputs used and the amount of waste generated in all of the different stages of the development process. So P matches with 2. Then we looked up at closed loop systems. So closed loop systems were defined as systems where the waste product can be used as a resource, either in the same process or elsewhere. So when the waste generated in one process can be used again in the same process or can be used as an input to another process, it forms a closed loop. That is, the waste does not end as the exit product. So it forms a closed loop. So Q matches with 1. And then we looked up at the two balance system, which is the mass balance system and energy balance system. So the energy balance system talked about is the system where the sum of energy going into a system must be equal to the sum of energy going out of it, plus any changes in the composition of that system. So R matches with 4. And then similarly, the mass balance was the sum of mass going into a system must be equal to the sum of mass going out or being stored in the system. So S matches with 3. So the correct answer was C, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. So moving on to question 5, select the correct order as per the waste hierarchy. So we looked up at the waste hierarchy again in the resource efficiency module. So we have different options like reduction of the amount of waste produced, reuse of materials, recycling of materials into new products, recovery of energy from waste, and landfill of any remaining waste. So you need to identify the correct order as per waste hierarchy. So again, all of these options are given in the ascending order. That is, the first step is listed first, followed by the second step, and so on. Okay, so we have an answer C. So the correct answer is A. That is, the first step that you do in waste hierarchy is to reduce the amount of waste which is produced. If you cannot reduce the waste produced, you need to reuse the materials. If you cannot reuse the material again, then you can recycle the material into the new product, followed by recovery of energy from the waste. And if this, after the recovery of energy, you can put them into landfills so that they do not become further polluting. They do not further pollute the environment. So the correct answer was A. So moving on to question 6. This is again a match the following terms of group A with their description in group B. So we have all of these definitions relating to this management and risk assessment. So you need to match group A with group B. Okay, so the correct answer is D, that is, risk is the outcome of hazards or hazardous events. Uh, that is, P matches with 4. Then hazard is the inherent property of an object to create damage to humans or the environment. So Q matches with 3. Then chronic hazards is hazards that cause harm over a period of time through long-term exposure, including typically include toxic chemicals and low-level radioactive materials. So R matches with 2. And then hazardous event is defined as an event where humans or other species are exposed to a hazard at high levels and harm to humans or the environment occur very quickly. So S matches with 1. So P matches with 4, Q matches with 3, R matches with 2, and S matches with 1. So D was the correct answer. So moving on to question 7. The process of evaluating and assigning a numerical value to the risk associated with an industry, which also includes the practices of probabilistic safety assessment and probabilistic risk analysis, PRA, is called A, quantitative risk assessment, or B, qualitative risk assessment. Okay, so A, quantitative risk assessment is the correct answer, as you stated. So moving on to question 8. So the region between lower tolerable limit and upper tolerable limit, that is the risk in between the two values, is known as. So we looked up at the these three different types of tolerable limits for risk in your project. So any of the projects should typically be below the acceptable risk category, whereas the X region is usually for there is a risk, but there's also benefit associated with the development of the project. So you can have uh, you can have projects in this category, but only if they have a benefit. But in no case should the project be in the unacceptable risk category. So the correct answer is A, which is the allowed region. So the tolerable if is also known as the allowed region, where the risk is taken only if a benefit is required from the project. So A was the correct answer. So moving on to question 9. Match the following terms of group A with their description in group B. So group A, we have additive effects, and in and synergistic effects, and in group B, we have two examples to both of these. So you need to match the terms. Okay, so we have an answer A. So the correct answer is B, that is additive effects are when two similar type of effects amplify the magnitude of the same effect. So for example, noise and noise together are additive effects. So P matches with 2, and synergistic effects are difficult to recognize and complex to assess because they are a combination of different types or different categories of effects. So for example, noise and visual together are synergistic effects. So B is the correct answer, as you stated. So moving on to question 10, the proximate cause test of significance for effect prediction for performing a defensible cumulative effect assessment, or CEA, includes the following. A, determining whether the proposal would proximately cause a significant effect on a given resource. B, investigating how the affected environment has reached its current condition and projected trajectory as a result of the aggregate effects of past actions, defining an appropriate spatial and temporal scale for the impact assessment. C, determining what happens to the condition and trends of this resource if no action is taken, including effects of other present and reasonably foreseeable future actions, and what happens to this maintained or altered trend if the proposed or alternative actions are taken, and D, all of the above. So we looked up at the approximate cost test of significance in the cumulative effects lecture. Okay, we have an answer D, which is the correct answer. So all of these three steps are used in the for effect prediction for performing a defensible cumulative effect assessment. So D is the correct answer. So moving on to question 11. So again, match the following terms of group A with their description given in group B. So in group A, we have terms related to cumulative impacts, value component, indirect impacts, and impact interactions. All of these from the lecture on cumulative impact assessment. And in group B, we have their definitions. You can remember the different graphical diagrams for the indirect impacts and impact interactions and cumulative impact. Okay, so the correct answer is B, that is cumulative impacts are impacts that arise from the successive, incremental, and or combined effects of an action project or activity when added to other existing planned and or reasonably anticipated future activities or projects. So P matches with 2. Valued components are environmental features that may be affected by a project and that have been identified to be of concern by the proponent or government agencies, Aboriginal people, or the public. So Q matches with 3. And then indirect impacts are impacts on the environment which are not a direct result of the project, often produced away from or as a result of a complex pathway. So R matches with 4. And then impact interactions are the reactions between impacts, whether between the impacts of just one project or between the impacts of other projects in the area. So S matches with 1. So B, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, R matches with 4, and S matches with 1 is the correct answer. So moving on to question 12. Which of the documents sets out the actions needed to manage environmental and social effects associated with the construction and operation of a development? Is it A, environmental and social management plans, ESMPs, or is it B, environment impact assessment, EIA, or C, scoping report, or D, baseline assessment report? Okay, so we have an answer A. So A is the correct answer. This is also the definition of environmental and social management plans. So these are basically the document which sets out which creates a link between the environmental impacts, environmental and social effects, impacts, and the mitigation strategies, as included in the EIA document, and associates it with the construction and operation of the development project. So A, environmental and social management plans, or ESMPs, was the correct answer, as you stated. So moving on to question 13. The key principles for successful environmental and social management plans, ESMPs, include the following. 1, contractual agreement. 2, cost of mitigation actions and implementation of the ESMP. 3, involvement of competent environmental professionals. And 4, identification of key documents or references. So which of the following options are the key principles which are included in the ESMPs? So you need to identify all of the 4 options, whichever is correct. Okay, so we have an answer D, which is the correct answer. So the ASMP, the key principles in the ASMP uh, methodology and structure include the contractual agreement, which is option 1, the competent environmental professionals, which is option 3, collaboration with stakeholders, stakeholder engagement, distribution of roles and responsibilities, identification of key documents or references, which is option 4, the procedure and approach to non-compliance. So all of the 4 options are the key principles which are included in the ESMPs. So D is the correct answer. Moving on to question 14. Identify the challenges in using environmental and social management plans, or ESMPs. First, need for environmental management responsiveness. 2, system to manage environmental impacts with careful monitoring of contract requirements. 3, periodic evaluation of environmental performance measures. And 4, all of the above. So again, you need to identify all of the options which are correct between 1 to 4. So again, we have an answer D, which is the correct answer. So all of the 3 mentioned options are the challenges which are faced by the ESMPs. So D was the correct answer. So moving on to question 15, this is a true and false question. So the environmental management plans, or EMPs, are listed in the World Bank's Operation Procedure 4.01 as an instrument for compliance with the bank's environmental assessment requirements. So is the statement true or false? So we did not look up at the guidances for EMPs in our discussion or highlights, but these were discussed in the lecture unit. So you also need to go through the lecture units for further details. So we have an answer A, which is the correct answer. So OP 4.01 is the World Bank OP 4.01 is lists environmental management plans as an instrument for compliance with environmental assessment requirements. So the statement was true. So moving on to week 11 assignment. So we will discuss the answers and solutions to week 11 assignment because the deadline for the same has passed. So we can discuss these questions. So if you have any questions so far, you can unmute yourselves and ask right away. Or you can put your questions in the chat box also. Or you can just unmute yourselves and ask. And then we will go forward with discussing week 11 assignment. Okay, so we will go forward with the week 11 assignment. So question one is which options among the given options is a component of the monitoring and evaluation of the settlement action plan? Is it A, monitoring, B, impact monitoring, C, completion audit, or D, all of the above? So we looked up at the key components of monitoring and evaluation of the settlement action plans. And we also looked up at the key indicators of the settlement action plan in the monitoring and evaluation stage. Okay, so we have an answer D in the chat box. So D is the correct answer. All of these three options, that is performance monitoring, impact monitoring, and completion audit, are monitoring and evaluation plan components for the resettlement action plan. So D, all of the above was the correct answer. So moving on to question 4, because question 2 and 3 we discussed in our previous assignments as well. So question 4 is a state true or false. Indigenous people are one of the associated ESS or environmental and social standards as per the AIIB's ESP of 2021. Is this statement true and false? So again, we did not discuss the AIIB's ESP, but this was again discussed in the lecture unit. Okay, so A is the correct answer. So the environmental and social standard 3 talks about indigenous people, whereas the environmental and social standard 1 talks about environmental and social assessment and management. Environmental and social standard 2 talks about land acquisition and voluntary resettlement. So again, because we discussed vulnerable groups, indigenous people are also considered as one of the vulnerable groups, and they have to be dealt very sensitively with the in the AIA process. So, but the statement was true, as you stated. So moving on to question 5, as per the life cycle assessment, resultant waste from processes is considered under which impact category? Is it A, upstream impacts, or B, downstream impact? So again, in life cycle assessment, we looked up at upstream and downstream impacts, which were associated with either of the input or waste side of the process. So here we are talking about the resultant waste from processes. So this is considered, as you clearly stated, in downstream impact, whereas the upstream impacts talk about the input, wherein how the original materials are produced, processed, and manufactured, how they are packaged and transported, and how they are used, whereas downstream impacts talk about how resulting wastes are managed in the project. So B was the correct answer. So moving on to question 6. So as per the Life Cycle Assessment Handbook, a guide for environmentally sustainable products, choose the correct option from the blue box to complete the General Methodology Framework for Life Cycle Assessment, LCA. So we had the Life Cycle Assessment Framework, and you need to identify what the blue box was. Is it A, impact assessment, or B, embodied energy calculation, C, operational energy calculation, or D, greenhouse gas emission assessment? So figures which talk about frameworks or assessments are also important, so you can remember the key methods or key steps. So the correct answer is A, that is impact assessment. Okay, so moving on to question 7, identify the most comprehensive framework for life cycle assessment amongst the following. Is it A, cradle to gate, B, cradle to site, C, cradle to use, or D, cradle to grave? Okay, so we did not discuss the different frameworks for life cycle assessment, but the cradle to grave is the most comprehensive framework. So the cradle to gate consider only from the manufacturing to the product stage, whereas cradle to site considers the manufacturing to construction process state, that is till the material reaches the site. Then the cradle to use considers the production to use state, that is the material is used in its form, whereas cradle to grave considers the material from the production to the end of life stage of the material and what happens post uh, post that stage. So cradle to grave is the most comprehensive framework for doing the life cycle assessment of materials. So D was the correct answer, as you correctly stated. Okay, so moving on to question 8, which among the following options is represented in a water balance diagram? Is it A, water used for cooling tower, or B, the solid waste generated on site, C, plastics disposed of on the site, or D, noise generated during construction? Okay, so the correct answer is A, that is water used for cooling tower. So the water balance diagram looked up at the water and its use in different forms. So the only option which talks about water use is option A, or anything related to water is option A, which was water used for cooling tower. Again, you can look up at the water balance diagram in the resource efficiency lecture. So moving on to question 9, the risk management framework is a component of EIA or environmental impact assessment. Is the statement true or false? Okay, so the statement is true as you stated in the options. So moving on to question 10, which of the following is an example of a chronic hazard? Is it A, prolonged exposure to radioactive material, B, risk of falling objects, C, risk of accidental injury, or D, risk of a natural hazard such as a landslide? So we looked up at the definition of chronic hazard, and you can use that definition to define which of the example matches with the correct option. Okay, so chronic hazard is defined as objects which can cause harm to humans by extended exposure but at relatively low levels. So option A, which talks about prolonged exposure to radioactive materials, given that radioactive materials are toxic to human health and can cause even death if they are used for a longer duration of time. So the example of chronic hazard was A, that is prolonged exposure to radioactive materials. Okay, so A was the correct answer. So moving on to question 11. Bhopal Union Carbide accident is an example of what kind of hazard? Is it A, acute hazard, C, biological hazard, or D, ergonomic hazard. So as you would remember, Bhopal Union Carbide accident was a result of the leak of the gas from the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, and this resulted in a number of deaths. Okay, so this type of hazard is an acute hazard where the humans or the human population was exposed to a short-term toxic substance. So this was an acute hazard because they were exposed to only short-term duration to a toxic substance. So B, acute hazard was the correct answer. So moving on to question 12. In context of AIA, CIA stands for what? Or B, cumulative industrial assessment, or C, comparative indicator assessment, or D, central investigation agency. Okay, so this is a fairly straightforward question where you just need to guess the uh, full form or the correct version of the abbreviation of CIA in terms of the environmental impact assessment. So CIA environmental impact assessment stands for cumulative impact assessment. So A is the correct answer. So moving on to question 13. The following methodological steps in their correct order as per cumulative effects assessment. And evaluation, two, scoping and baseline, or three, mitigation. So you need to arrange them in the correct order of how these steps are followed. So just a basic understanding of the different stages of EIA for the different components can also help you answer this question. So the correct answer and baseline is done first. Prediction and evaluation of impact. And the third step is mitigation efforts towards the which are the the definitions from Group B with their correct headings from Group A. So we have cumulative effects, and synergistic effects, and their definitions in Group 2. Match the correct order. Okay, so the correct answer is C, that is cumulative effects, are effects arising from the successive incremental and action. So P matches with 3. Then additive effects are the sum of magnitudes of the same type of effect, like noise and noise. So Q matches with 1. Then synergistic effects are a combination of different types or different categories of effects, like noise and visual. So R matches with 2. So P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 2. So C is the correct answer, as it clearly stated. So moving on to question 15, which is the last question in the assignment. So this is a match the legislation from Group A with the countries of origin from Group B. So in Group 1, we have countries, and Group B have the legislations which in the particular country. So you need to legislations with the countries of origin. So again, you need to know the guidances and the different form of legislation practices which are used in different countries, especially in India, for the different components of EIA. Okay, so the correct answer is The correct answer is C. That is, Hong Kong uses the CAP 499 Environmental Impact Assessment Ordinance. So P matches with 3. Whereas South Africa uses the National Environmental Management Act, Act number 107 of 1998. Whereas India has the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So I matches with 2. So C, that is P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 2 is the correct answer. So that concludes the assignment 11. So if you have any queries, you can just unmute yourself and ask now. Or alternatively, you can also put them in the chat box, or you can, if you have any queries while viewing the content for the different weeks, you can put your questions in the discussion forums. We usually go through the discussion forums and try to answer your queries in these problem solving sessions. Okay. Hi, Jeshli, do you have a query?
More or less, when we study, everything sometimes confuses. So, in which area or which part of your lecture can we concentrate for the exam, ma'am?
So I'm not sure if I understand your query. When you go through the lecture content, they are a bit confusing. So you want the so what do you want?
For my exam,
Yeah.
so which are the key points that I need to concentrate, ma'am?
So in terms of my understanding, so as a if you do an analysis of the questions which you have seen in the assignment as well, so you would notice a lot of the questions come from the description of the definitions and concepts, as well as if there is like key key legislation or guidance document which was an important movement for a particular component. So those are also important. Then if anything, especially any ordinance or any guidance particular to India is also very important. And then if there was a key concept, like for example, uh, let's say if there was a key concept which was very new to the in the lecture, that is also important. Other than that, general discussions are okay, but most of the questions you see are from descriptions, concepts, and the laws and guidances documents. So I would suggest you can probably underline and understand those things from all of the lecture units.
Yes, ma'am.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. But I would also suggest that before you go to the examination, you do like a review of all of the assignment questions and the answers, just so you understand what was majorly discussed.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. Welcome. Does anybody have any other queries? Okay, if we do not have any other queries, thank you so much for attending this problem solving session for week 11. And if you have any queries, you can put them in the discussion forums. The slides from this presentation and the YouTube video for this, a YouTube link for this video session will be put in YouTube and can be accessed from the Google Sheet, which is in the problem solving session module. So you can go through them again if you want to revise any of the key concepts. So, and if you have any feedback, you can give us feedback in the feedback forms for the problem solving session, especially. So, thank you so much. And I would now close the session.